So, hello everyone. Good morning. Thank you for traveling through the snow to be here today. My name is Peggy Erickson, and I am the co-chair, along with Tracy Flood, of last year's Human Rights Council. And this is last year's Human Rights Conference, so welcome. I have some announcements to make before we get started. First of all, I did make the announcement about parking permits. You need to have a parking permit on the dash of your car. There are some at the registration table. There's an agenda for the day in your program. There are also evaluations in your program. We have a few changes, so we'll tell you about those as well. If you have cell phones, would you please put them on stun? Bathrooms are up to my right and around the corner. There is Wi-Fi available for you today, and the ID and password are on the program if you must. There's a map which is going to be important in your folders, and our workshops are a little bit scattered today, so you're going to need the map to get to the workshops that you're going to want to go to after lunch. We have some tabling materials behind me in the lounge area, so please visit those at the break. Since our December program, we've had some program changes. We lost our original keynote, Joy Williams, and just this week, our second keynote fell sick, but we were lucky enough to get another keynote to replace them. But we have one keynote for you today, and we're going to have an adult panel also, so that'll be really exciting. And Cheryl Nunez has agreed to facilitate that for us, so we're thrilled. To begin today's conference, I would like to acknowledge the fact that we are standing on Suquamish ancestral lands. The Suquamish have been here for 10,000 years. Take that in. They built the largest longhouse ever known. In 1792, George Vancouver anchored in Port Madison Bay near Suquamish. That was first contact for the Salish tribes of Kitsap. And between then and when we became a territory in 1853, over 75% of the native people of this land perished from diseases such as smallpox that they had no immunity to. In 1855, the Treaty of Point Elliott was signed, and Chief Seattle was a signatory to that treaty. In it, the Suquamish people gave up about 70,000 acres of land here in Kitsap County and agreed to live on 8,000-acre reservation in Suquamish. The S'Klallam and Skokomish people were also assigned to reservations. Then in 1870, the U.S. government burned the Suquamish Longhouse to the ground. Shortly after, the federal government passed laws requiring Native children to be placed in boarding schools where their culture and their practices and their language were all forbidden. The government privatized the reservation land, allowing it to be sold, and so about 5,000 of the 8,000 acres were sold off from the Suquamish Reservation. Also, about that time, Native ceremonies were outlawed. So for 112 years, these policies were in place. It wasn't until 1978. Who was alive in 1978? It wasn't until 1978, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, that Native parents could keep their children at home. And also the Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, and the tribes could once again try and piece their ceremonies, their language, and their culture back together. These assimilation policies failed, though, because the Suquamish, the S'Klallam, the Skokomish are all still here with us and persevere and have recaptured much of their culture and continue to do so. So let's stand with local tribes and insist that treaties be honored, tribal rights be upheld, and tribal nations be acknowledged as true governments, because tribal rights are human rights. Now I would like to call up Tracy.
Good morning. I want to take an opportunity to introduce our dignitaries this morning, as well as members of the Human Rights Council, and then we're going to move into a little presentation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this morning, and throughout the day, we will probably have different dignitaries stopping by, and if we have the opportunity, we would like to acknowledge them. And this morning, we would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge Sheriff Simpson from the Bremerton City Council. We have Richard Huddy, as well as Greg Wheeler. And we are happy to be able to host and be hosted by Olympic College. And I believe that we have Cheryl Nunez, who is one of the Olympic College vice presidents, and she's the vice president of diversity and equity and inclusion. Yes, I think she's here. There she is. So we want to just definitely thank our host site. In the past, if you've come to our events and our conference, we have been at the conference center, and because we consider this an opportunity to present and educate and to give knowledge to our community, we thought what better partnership than here with Olympic College. And so we're really excited about this opportunity. We had the snow, then we had a little snowflakes last night, so I don't know. We're kind of beginning to think about this whole weather change and global warming, if it really exists. So with that, also I want to acknowledge our council members who are here. As Peggy said, me and Peggy have co-chaired this last year. Our new chair for this year is here, Data Logan, here. So you guys look forward to working with him throughout this coming year. And then we also have council members over here. And I would want to have them kind of give a wave off. We've got 3 of them. We have a lot more, but they're here to help. They help with check-in, but we're excited to be able to have this today. And now we're going to move into our presentation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without further ado.
So we've been in existence as a council since 1986, when this council was formed in response to a cross burning in North Kitsap. And we don't feel like we're out of the woods yet. In fact, we've had quite a few hate crimes here in Kitsap over the last year. So we felt like we would like to open the conference with a reading of a simplified reading of the Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed by the UN in 1948. So we're going to just kind of rotate around and speak into the mic as we go.
All people are born free. All people are born equal, and so have equal rights. People can think for themselves and understand what's going on around them. Everyone should act as brothers and sisters.
It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what your religion is, what your sexual orientation is, what your political opinions are, what country you come from, or who your family is. It doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor. It doesn't matter what part of the world you come from, whether your country is a kingdom or a republic. These rights and freedoms are meant to be enjoyed by everyone.
Everyone has the right to live, the right to be free, the right to personal safety. No one can be someone else's slave. No one is to be hurt or to be punished in cruel or humiliating ways. The law must be the same for everyone. The law must protect everyone. People have the right to be protected by the courts so that their rights are represented and respected. People cannot be arrested or sent away from their country unless it is for a very serious reason. Everyone has the right to a fair trial.
No one has the right to interfere in other people's private lives, in their families, their homes, or in their private communications.
People have the right of free movement within their country. People have the right to leave any country, even if their own, and then return. No person shall have their nationality taken away from them. This means everyone has the right to belong to a nation, and they also have the right to change their nationality if they want to.
All people have the right to get married and have a family. Once they reach a certain age, it doesn't matter what race, nationality, sexual orientation, or religion they are. Two people can only get married if they both want to.
Everyone has the right to own property. Anything that belongs to a person can't be taken away from them unless there is a fair reason.
Everyone has the right to think the way they like. People have the right to hold opinions and tell other people what their opinions are. They have the right to practice their religion in private or in public. All people have the right to meet together and form associations. No one can be forced to join an association if they don't want to.
A government's authority comes from the will of the people. People must show what they want their government to do by voting. Everyone of a certain age has the right to vote.
Everyone has the right to work, and people have the right to choose the kind of job they want to do. Everyone has the right to good working conditions. Everyone has the right to equal pay for equal work. People should earn enough to keep themselves and their families healthy, to give them enough to eat, enough to clothe themselves, somewhere to live, and medical attention when they are ill. Everyone has the right to rest. They should have a limited number of working hours and should be still paid while they are on holiday.
All children have the same rights, no matter who their parents are. Everyone has the right to go to school, and school must be free. Everyone has the right to be taught a trade. Education should emphasize understanding, comprehension, tolerance, and friendship.
People have duties toward the place they live and towards other people who live with them. None of these rights can be used to justify taking away the rights and freedoms set out in this declaration. The end. Stay up here because we're going to do the appreciation. So hang for a minute. So while I have the council up here, and before we get formally started for the day, we would like to do an appreciation. And unfortunately, the people we're appreciating weren't able to come today, but we're going to do it anyway, and they're going to see it on BKAT. By the way, we are recording with BKAT, so just to let you know. There's one person who every year spends numerous hours doing graphics arts work for the council. Just look at the beautiful program we have today. And for this, we would like to deeply thank Erica Hendricks for her work. So thank you, Erica. Thank you. There is another person without whose tireless support the council would not be able to function. She's there to guide us through county processes, to support our every need and request. She spends a lot of her own time, Saturdays and evenings, coming to our meetings and our events. And she does this not only for our council, but for numerous other councils in the county. So we'd like to deeply appreciate now Rebecca Pirtle. Thank you, Rebecca. If any of you, by the way, have a passion for human rights, we do have several vacancies on our council in all the districts of this county. So please, there's information about how to contact Rebecca in your program, and please consider joining the council if this is something you'd like to do. Okay, thank you, council. Well, in 2012, realizing the complete deficiency of my education in either racism or social justice, I signed up for a workshop in Seattle called Undoing Institutional Racism. It was offered by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. One of the trainers that day was Dustin Washington, and he completely transformed my understanding of racism. Dustin is the director of Community Justice Program for the American Friends Service Committee. He's a core trainer with the People's Institute, and he's clinical faculty at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. His work centers around developing humanistic anti-racist leadership across the nation via Freedom Schools and YUIR projects, which I'm sure he'll tell us about. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Faith Action Network Social Justice Award, Fellowships of Reconciliation Martin Luther King Jr. Award, and Seattle Human Services Coalition Ron Chisholm Anti-Racist Leadership Award. Please help me in welcoming Dustin Washington.
Good morning. Good morning. So, on my drive over, I was thinking what topics do I want to cover in the realm of implicit bias? It's a broad conversation. And what I thought about this morning is that implicit bias, in its most simple definition, really defines how we've been conditioned and socialized to think about the world. And when we think about implicit bias in the context of race and racism, one of the most important tools that we have to understand how we've internalized, how we've been conditioned, how we've been socialized to think about race and racism is to understand history. And it's important for us to understand that in many ways we live in an ahistorical society. Would that be a fair statement? Yes? And many of us have not truly been taught the history of how race and racism was constructed within the boundaries of the United States. Would that be a fair statement? And so what I would like to do is take us through a brief walk through history and then open up the dialogue for a conversation where we can talk with each other. My favorite form of communication is us really engaging with each other. And so when I talk about racism, I am not talking about just not liking someone. I'm not necessarily talking about calling someone a mean name. I'm not talking about discrimination necessarily. When I'm talking about racism, and for the framing of this conversation, we will be talking about racism as a system of privilege and power. And we will be talking about racism through the context of racial disparities that we see across every system in the United States, bar none. If we were to look at housing, transportation, education, incarceration, every single system that we engage with in our lives, we will see that those who have come to be called white in our society are doing better than all people of color. And we have to understand history to not only understand why the systems look the way they look today in terms of racial disparities, but how can we begin to do more effective work to root out the racism that has been embedded in our systems. So I want to take us back to the year of 1787. And 1787 was one of the most important years in the history of this country. It was a year that the United States Constitution was founded, our most important and founding legal document. And in 1787, the United States, the Congress, the Senate began to define who would be seen as a citizen, and consequently, who would have all of the rights of a citizen within the United States, or at that time in history, within the 13 colonies. And there was something that went on called the 3/5 Compromise. And people of African descent, by that point in history, were in a permanent state of chattel slavery. Our conditioning, our value within the society was essentially no different than a mule, a plow. But Southern legislators wanted to count their enslaved Africans as full human beings, not in terms of how they would be treated, but for the purpose of voting power, power in the House of Congress. And we should all understand that the amount of legislators that you would have in the House of Congress is determined by your population. And the northern states did not want to give the southern states all of this power. So there was negotiating, debates, fighting, and they came up with something that was called the 3/5 Compromise. And it was stated in the Constitution that those of us of African descent would be considered as 3/5 of a human being. People, First Nations people, Native Americans, indigenous people, if they were to keep their tribal affiliation, they were not to be counted by the Constitution. People that we now label as Latino or Hispanic or Latina or Latinx weren't counted by the Constitution because there was no concept of Latino or Hispanic. The people that we now politically call Hispanic or Latino were in their homelands. People that we collectivize as Asian or API, there was no concept of API. History will tell us the first Chinese came to the United States around 1810. So when we go back and look at the Constitution, again, remember, they are working to determine who is going to be considered a full human being, a full citizen, and who would have access to all the rights of citizenship of the United States. So again, African American people, black people, were considered 3/5 of a human being. Indigenous people, again, if they were to keep their tribal affiliation, were not to be counted as full human beings. And we'll look very quickly what happened to indigenous people who even gave up their tribal affiliation. And so, no concept of Latino, no concept of Asian. So let me ask the room, who then was considered to be a full human being? What peoples? So I hear white people and I hear white men. White men. Okay, that's good. And one of the things we want to say is that we understand because of patriarchy that there was a different relationship between white women and white men in terms of access to power. But the very first act of Congress in 1790 was the Naturalization Act. And what the Naturalization Act did was to codify who could be a citizen. And what the Naturalization Act said that to be a citizen of the United States of America, you would have to be free, and what that meant was free from indentured servitude. You would have to be white and of good moral character. The Naturalization Act made no differentiation between male and female. But we know, again, because of sexism, because of patriarchy, there was a different relationship to power between white men and white women, between poor white people and wealthy white people. But we know there was a profoundly different relationship to power between indigenous women, African women, and white women. So we're going to say that those who would come to be called white, seen as white, would be given the rights of full citizenship. And it's important for us to understand that our country was founded on that notion. In 1830, Andrew Jackson ran for president, and he ran as a populist. Populism is a big thing again in our country, right? And what Andrew understood was that a lot of European indentured servants were living out their servitude, and they were wanting what they were promised at the end of their servitude, which was land. And by that point in history, all of the prime land along the eastern seaboard had been taken up by the wealthy, the gentry. And his platform really centered around, we are going to get you land. Now, if all the land had been taken up along the eastern seaboard, where else would they have to go to get more land? West. And whose land would they be taking? Indigenous people. And so we have to understand that there were treaties signed by the United States government with many of the tribes along the eastern seaboard. And so when we say that indigenous people would not be considered citizens if they didn't give up their tribal affiliation, tribes like the Cherokee and many of the tribes along the southeastern part of the colonies would give up their tribal affiliation, give up their religious ways of being, give up their way of relating to the land, and essentially assimilate into whiteness. But when Andrew Jackson became president, he pushed forward a law called the Indian Removal Act. And this law went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court struck down this law because of the treaties they had on the books. But Andrew Jackson, being the ambitious man that he was, said that's fine if the Supreme Court strikes down these laws. I still have the military, and we are going to forcibly remove these people. And what happened was something that many of you might have heard about, was something called the Trail of Tears, where people, Cherokee people and other tribes of the southeastern portion of this country were forcibly removed from their land and sent along into the territory of what is now the state of Oklahoma and northern Texas. And so even indigenous people who gave up their tribal affiliation and attempted to fully assimilate into whiteness were still forcibly removed. As we go a little bit further throughout history, we can go to 1848. And 1848, the United States entered into a war with the nation of Mexico. And this war really centered around the expansion of slavery. The state of Texas was prime fertile ground for the most profitable crop of the southern states, which was cotton. And so people began to encroach on the landmass of Texas, which again was part of the nation of Mexico. And the nation of Mexico didn't like that happening. Eventually, the United States entered into a war with the country of Mexico, and the United States won the war. And at the end of the war, there was a treaty signed called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And Article 5 of the treaty stated that if you held land as a Mexican citizen after the war, you would still be able to hold that land. But what began to happen was a violent removal of people from their land that they owned. And when people would go, Mexican people who were formerly Mexican people, now non-citizens living in the United States, would attempt to sue in the court systems of the United States to enforce Treaty 5, the courts would come back and say that yes, Treaty 5 said you could keep this land, but because you were not a citizen of the United States, based on the 1790 Naturalization Act, that again said to be a citizen, you have to be free, white, and of good moral character. You have no rights within our court system. And what you would see was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of North America. So states that were once part of Mexico, California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, all those states went from being Mexican states now to states that would be taken under an ideology of manifest destiny, that this was to be a country by and for those who have come to be called white. Moving a little bit further throughout history, and it's important for us to look at history consistently repeats itself. And there was a case in 1857. If anyone's an attorney in the room, I imagine you studied this case in law school. And it was a case of a man by the name of Dred Scott. And history has framed this case as the Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott was an enslaved African who moved with his master to a free state. And he assumed that because I am now in a free state, I also should be free. And he petitioned for his freedom. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court eventually denied his petition. But they came back and said some key words that have, in many ways, defined the relationship of African American people to the criminal justice system of this country. And the courts came back and said that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And so when we talk about implicit bias in criminal justice, and we see all the things that we've been able to see on the news and social media of black men being killed and no one held to account, we think about the case in North Carolina where we saw a black man, many of us saw this, a black man running from the police, back to the police, shot in his back, then evidence was planted on him. All of us could see this, and yet and still there was a mistrial in the court case. And so this ideology, this implicit bias of the value, the rights of an African American man has been deeply embedded not only in our institutional fabric, but in our collective psyche within the United States of America. And so I just want to share just two more history days because I think it is really important as you all begin to engage today and tomorrow around implicit bias, it's important to have a framing around race and racism, a historical framing. In 1896, another seminal court case was passed called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this was based around an African American man who could pass as white, whose name was Homer Plessy. And he sat in a whites-only car in New Orleans, Louisiana. And his sitting at the car wasn't, how Rosa Parks has been framed as an accident. She just sat down, she was tired. This was a strategic decision, an organizing decision. And Homer got removed from this card. And this led to court cases challenging the notion of separate but equal. And again, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court confirmed and solidified the notion legally of separate but equal. And this would be the law of the land as it related to people of color and those who have come to be called white, all the way up essentially to the civil rights movement, or at least to 1954 with the Brown v. Board decision. And so it's important, again, that legalized segregation was the law of the land in the southern states, and through the process of redlining in the northern states was embedded within our culture, was accepted, and the white supremacy that came out of that was the norm. That was the norm. That people of color, African Americans, and other people of color were to be second-class citizens. And so as we get to the civil rights movement, from essentially the 1950s to the 1970s, we had people from historically oppressed communities marching, protesting, filing lawsuits. We had children having dogs sicked on them. We had little girls blown up in churches. We had countless people assassinated just for us to break the back of legalized segregation, legalized Jim Crow. But as a nation, we never changed the basic foundations of any of the systems in this country. And so the argument that I want to put forward is that implicit bias, white supremacy, and racism was built into the fabric of every one of our systems. Every one of our systems in this country were set up by and for those who have come to be called white. And so the messages that we've received about our worth and our value within this society have been messages that have embedded implicit bias, or as we would say, internalized racial oppression within all of us. And these become a set of messages that just become normal. We don't question them, we live them out. And if that was not the case, as a nation, we would be engaged in a movement. Every single one of us and every single person in this community would be engaged in a movement to root out the racial disparities that exist in every system. But by and large, we accept the racial disparities as normal in our society. And that understanding of acceptance ought to be the initial framing of looking at any notion of an implicit bias. And as we think about implicit bias, it's become kind of a buzzword as of late, right? And it's become kind of a watered down way of looking at structural, systemic, and institutional racism and internalized racism. And so the work that we do, we fundamentally believe in the only way to change the systems that exist in this country is to engage in what we would call anti-racist organizing. I just want to share just really briefly, and I'd like to open this up for some questions, but some of the young people that I work with in Seattle began to get a deep understanding of the prison industrial complex and how the impact of mass incarceration on African American people and other people of color and poor people in this country. And what they begin to analyze is at the tail end of the civil rights movement, as a backlash to the gains of the civil rights movement, that they would begin to see that there was an explosion in incarceration in this country. We went from roughly 200,000 people incarcerated in the 1970s to well over 2 million today. And in every state across the union, there will be disproportionality. And as a matter of fact, Washington State, per capita, has a higher disproportionality of African Americans in states like Mississippi or Alabama. And what they, through this analysis, this growing analysis of the prison industrial complex, and beginning to frame the prison industrial complex as modern day slavery, they begin to look at the proposed construction of a new youth detention center in Seattle, which was framed by the powers that be as a Youth and Family Justice Center. But it was a jail. It's a jail. And they looked at the fact that while overall numbers of those who have been incarcerated was driven down from the 1990s to 2012, the racial disparities of African American youth actually increased. So in King County, in Martin Luther King County, African Americans make up 8% of the county, but are over 50% of the youth that are incarcerated within the detention center. And they also begin to understand that it was wrong public policy to spend $210 million on building a new jail to lock up children. And instead, they begin to believe that that $210 million could be spent on the front end and start to address the root causes of why so many children, African American children, are engaging with the criminal justice system. Whether that would be systemic racism in education, lack of access to good housing, lack of access to good transportation, lack of access to living wage jobs. So they begin to organize, and they lit a fire under the county and the people of Seattle. And to the point where this week, the mayor of Seattle, city council members from both the King County Council and the city council and the King County executive have written op-eds, letters calling for the reconsidering of building this jail. And thank you. And they were also able to get other victories along the way. The county proposed building 210 new beds. They've got the young people organized and got that cut down to 100. They got the county to bring in more anti-racist restorative justice programming, helping the county to begin to look at the impact of multi-generational trauma that stems from living in a society that has been structured around race and racism. And they were also able to get the county to stop incarcerating young people for status offenses like truancy. But they are not stopping, we are not stopping until we stop this jail. And again, our core belief is that this jail is a monument to racism. And we understand that when we think of internalized oppression, implicit bias, either we think there is something fundamentally more criminal about African Americans or African American youth, or there's something is wrong with the system. Our argument is there's something is wrong with the system. And we believe the only way the system changes in this country is not from the grass tops, but the change that we need and that has happened, the structural change in this country has happened from the bottom up. Folks, everyday people like we have in this room today who are organizing from a place of clarity, organizing from a place of a strong analysis of race and racism, and understanding both their implicit bias and their internalized oppression, and how implicit bias and internalized oppression can keep us from organizing against racism. So at this point, what I would like to do is first have y'all thank me so I can sip my water. And just open up to any questions from the room.
Good morning, Dustin. Karen Vargas. We've worked with you all over at the Freedom School. How can we begin to do this important work over here in Kitsap County? One of the things that we are intentional about is educating our young people about the school-to-prison pipeline. And we really need to give them the language, the history, and the understanding of how that is institutionalized even with school disciplines. Could you elaborate to us on some of the work that you all have already been doing over there in those areas?
Thank you, Karen. It's good to see you again, too. So Karen talked about a project that we have called the Tyree Scott Freedom School. And essentially we take young people in the summer, 2 times in the summer in Seattle, once in the winter in Seattle. We take young people through a 5-day process of beginning to understand poverty in the United States, how we've been conditioned to look at poor people, and we've been conditioned to blame poor people for being in poverty. Looking at the history and construction again, briefly what I talked about this morning, we spent a lot more time with them looking at that. And really ultimately helping them to understand their place within a racialized society and how they can begin to take leadership and see themselves as anti-racist organizers. And so Karen, you might not know this, but we're now doing freedom schools across the country, in Philadelphia, in Denver, Colorado, in New York City, in St. Louis, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, St. Paul, Minnesota, Charleston, West Virginia. And out of those freedom schools is a group called Youth Undoing Institutional Racism. And that's a vehicle for the young people to continue to take action specifically around not just a school to prison pipeline, but the birth to prison pipeline. So Karen, the short answer to your question is, let's talk, let's pull together a team in this community who want to make this happen, and we will support you and make it happen.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Alan Newbert, and my question is what, if any, does the current political debate in this country over school choice and voucher systems and the current nominations for the Director of the Program of Education? So I'd like your feedback on that.
Can you say your question just a tad bit louder, please?
Yeah, my question is, what does the current debate over school choice and the use of vouchers in public education have to do with these issues in your mind?
So I see the debate, my understanding analysis around this specific debate around school choice is an attack on public education. And it's part of a right-wing movement to attack, to privatize the public sector. And if we understand neoliberal economics, which is an economic school of thought that's come out of the University of Chicago, but really is rooted in our whole economic system, there is a push to privatize everything. Public sector unions, education, because there's an opportunity for some folks to make profit. And so in many ways, it's become a race to the bottom. And if we understand the attack, especially on the public sector unions, that's in many ways an attack on people of color. The way people of color in this country have been able to get into the middle class has been through public sector employment. And it's an attack on the collective political power of people of color by attacking the unions, by attempting to privatize schools. So really, it's the conversation. I would encourage you to study, if you haven't already, neoliberalism, and look at the core concepts undergirding neoliberalism, and I think you'll get some more clarity around why there's a push to privatize education and essentially to privatize everything, Social Security, because there's money to be made at a human cost. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Richard Huddy. I'm with the Bremerton City Council. And in 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
A little louder.
In 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech that resonated with me, the title of which was, "Where do we go from here?" in which he concluded that our search for racial justice was really going to be found when we achieved economic justice. And that really has resonated with me. I just feel like we've gone the other way in so many ways, especially since 1980. as our new American aristocracy has consolidated in the United States? And I just wanted to get your comments about that.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. When Dr. King, towards the end of his life, Dr. King really understood that even though we passed civil rights laws in this country, that it meant nothing if you can now sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger at the lunch counter. And he began to understand the interconnection between what he would call the three pillars of oppression: racism, capitalism, and militarism. And what many of us aren't taught on Martin Luther King Day, we've been inundated with the I Have a Dream speech, but Martin Luther King not only had a dream, he had a vision. And at the end of his life, he was working to bring poor white people from Appalachia, poor indigenous people from the reservations, poor black people from the ghettos, poor Latinos from the barrios, in the context of a poor people's movement. And his intent was to go to DC and not just have a march, but to shut DC down until there was a guaranteed income and a actualized poor people's Bill of Rights within the United States. So I think your point is well taken, that in this country we cannot talk about race and racism without talking about capitalism and economics. And I think this time in history calls us to have a very sober dialogue in this nation about the potential for there to ever be meaningful equity if we don't wrestle with predatory capitalism. Thank you. So I think I have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Renee Kimball-Rouse, and I am Native American and Norwegian. My mom was full-blood Alaska Native, and she did a wonderful job about teaching me how to walk in both worlds. I don't know how she did that, because my grandma was taken from Alaska as a young girl and put into a Catholic school in Oregon. And so if we were caught by my grandma hearing her speak her native tongue, she would get very upset with us. And I believe you were right, around 1978 was when, trying to explain to my grandma, we do not get in trouble for that anymore. But my thing is historical trauma, and then we've seen like my grandkids ending up in foster care or bringing them back, and trying to heal this historical trauma that goes on. I mean, you lose contact with them in the foster care system. My granddaughter is now back in my family and adopted by a family member, but it's a hard trauma to just bring them back into the community. I don't know.
You know, the thing I would say is one of the things racism has done to all of us in this room, and it's been done intentionally as a tool of social control. And so much of our work has got to be healing around the impact of multi-generational trauma as it relates to racism, both as people of color. If you think about images that we've seen of lynchings, right? You're gonna see a black body mutilated, hung from a tree. But around those lynchings, you're gonna see a white family with blankets spread out, having a picnic, taking pictures, smiling. Racism has not only dehumanized people of color multi-generationally, it has also dehumanized white people multi-generationally. And that dehumanization gets passed down multi-generationally, it doesn't get talked about, and it causes us to act in ways that accept the society as it is today. So one of the most important things that we can begin to do is to create spaces for meaningful and authentic healing. Because if we don't value ourselves, we're not gonna do the work we need to do to create a more humanistic and just society. So much of this work has got to be about all of us getting back to a sense of our power, understand what has been done to all of us, and moving towards, again, a more humanistic society. So I have been given my zero amount of time left. So I want to thank you all for allowing me to be here today. Thank you.
You can see why we asked him here today. Thank you so much, Dustin, for helping to further our education. We're going to set up now for our youth panel, and so just hang there for about a half a minute.